Royal ladies throughout history have made their marks in varying ways, and it's time to dive more into royalty throughout the ages. Aside from mainstream medieval queen information, we've also got more modern controversy, the roles of lady royals in general throughout the years, and more. So hold on to your crowns, folks. So, how much power did medieval queens really have? Well, one of the big debates in this area of research is whether we should use the terms power or agency when referring to queens from that time period. Agency is being able to decide something for yourself and not have someone tell you what to do, whereas power is more about telling someone else what to do. Agency is often used in relation to medieval queens, but there is an argument that this might underplay the power of queens, because the so-called soft power is harder to see. That type of influence, particularly when exerted over queens' husbands, may have taken place in private and not necessarily been noted down. Equally, sometimes it's not recorded because, especially way back then, chroniclers didn't want to overplay the power of women, and maybe they weren't as aware of the power of women in those more intimate settings. Obviously, it's much easier to see regnant and regent queens exercising power and authority by ruling on their own right, ruling on behalf of somebody younger, or an absentee king, or standing in for a king who is incapacitated, as in the cases of Margaret of Anjou, Isabeau of Bavaria, queen consorts of King Henry VI of England and Charles VI of France, respectively. Very fascinating stuff. Specifically during the Middle Ages, royal marriages were arranged as a way to forge alliances and strengthen political power. So we're talking about princesses now. They were often betrothed at a young age to princes from other kingdoms or regions. These marriages were not based on love, but rather on the strategic interests of the families involved. A princess's primary duty was to produce an heir and secure the succession of a dynasty. Once married, she also had to navigate the complex politics of court life. She was expected to be a gracious hostess, entertaining important guests, attending events, but she was also expected to support her husband in his political endeavors, and to act as a mediator between him and other members of the court. So not an easy job. For much of history, the offspring of British monarchs specifically, well, they were kind of raised by nannies, almost never mixed with commoners, and spent a lot of their time being drilled by private tutors in history, decorum, and various dead languages. By all accounts, the young Princess Victoria was a skillful horsewoman, a good musician, and a keen dancer. She was taught Greek and Latin at home and had the occasional dancing lesson from a famous ballerina. But at the same time, she was deliberately isolated from any outside influences, bombarded with a great deal of devotional literature, moral tales, and sermons, and her playmates were pretty much her dolls and sometimes her half-sister. She reportedly later described her youth as rather melancholy. As an adult, she became harsh and seemingly disdainful of her own offspring, calling them ugly, nasty, frog-like. Eleanor of Aquitaine is often portrayed as one of the most powerful queens in history. Wife, mother, and counselor of kings, crusader, landowner, patron of the arts, her power eventually grew so great, at least in the eyes of one royal husband, that he chose to lock her up. But what if she wasn't exceptional? What if, in the manner and degree to which she exerted power, she was very much in line with royal women throughout history? So, royal women exerted power in at least 4 ways. They influenced policy. They influenced the behavior of those both above and below them in rank. They acted as go-betweens, and they patronized clients. In addition, they were often involved in determining succession, governing, building alliances, and expanding or defending territory. The most powerful of all were the queen rulers. They were a little more rare, but they packed almost as much political punch as their male counterparts. In the 7th century CE, Lady Kawal Ajal of Kabul in the Yucatan Peninsula presided over quite a group of warriors and statesmen, and when she died, she left behind one of the most successful kingdoms in Mayan history. Even if they were barred from the top job, these women were powerful. In 4 societies in particular, widows of rulers acted as regents for their sons and had the same policy-making powers as male rulers. Lady Hao of China lost her status as the main wife on the death of her son, but clawed it back by recruiting an army of more than 13,000 and leading it to war. The Hawaiians practiced gender separation, and royal women's power was limited with respect to men's, but it was still pretty considerable for the time. They controlled the same amount of wealth, made their own deals, distributed their own gifts, and proposed improvements to agriculture and aquaculture. Also, they ordered deaths and pardons. There is a lot of mystery surrounding Princess Olga of Kiev, but what we do know is she was a Ukrainian princess and the first female ruler in Russian history. She became queen regent in 945 CE after her husband, Igor, was slain. And seeing as her son was a little too young to rule, she was crowned queen while they waited for him to grow up. One of her first acts was to seek revenge for her husband's demise. By her orders, the men responsible were captured and killed using boiling water. And she didn't stop there. In her fury, she ordered hundreds of people from that man's tribe to be taken out in retribution for her husband. Some accounts suggested that she had them buried alive, and that she devised a plan to set their entire town on fire. One story suggests she fooled the tribe leaders by inviting them to a retreat, then locked them in a bathhouse and burned that down. Whatever really happened, she devoted herself to Orthodox Christianity shortly after her vengeance was complete. And despite her past, she eventually became the first person of Russian heritage to receive sainthood from the Orthodox Church. Is there a particular point during the medieval period, in particular, that queens held more power than in other times? There used to be a feeling that the early Middle Ages, so when you see folks like Emma of Normandy, Edith of Wessex, it was kind of a high point for medieval queenship, or so we thought. This is because the looser structures of monarchy gave women a lot more space for power and authority. Then, as succession became more regularized and it was more established, it was argued that queens primarily became, well, a mean word for horses, and that their power and influence waned until the early modern period when women like Catherine de' Medici, which she was wild, and England's Tudor queens came along. But that's a theory that's actually been kind of challenged. And actually, we see a lot more continuity in terms of the power queens exercised. Yes, the nature of power changed as monarchy changed, but if you look at the 12th century and the proposed low point for medieval queens, there's a lot of reigning women wielding a great deal of influence. Urraca of Castile, Melisande of Jerusalem, Tamar of Georgia, and a lot of other empresses, they had a lot of power. Japanese imperial law states that princesses are not allowed to marry commoners, so when they do, they're expected to give up their position in the royal family. Well, in more recent times, Princess Mako, the granddaughter of Emperor Akito, was very much aware of this when she announced her engagement to Kei Komuro in 2017. She said in a press conference that she has always known what the consequences of her decision would be, and she strived to fulfill her duties while she still could. She eventually gave up her title in 2021 and now works at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, assisting curators with the museum's Asian art collection. So it might not be as wild as a lot of the medieval queens, but giving up your life's legacy for love is memorable, meaningful, and kind of history-making. Wu Zetian was born to a relatively wealthy family and had extremely progressive parents, becoming well-versed in a wide range of subjects, including writing, music, literature, and very importantly for today, politics and governmental affairs. When she was quite young, Wu was summoned to the imperial palace to become a concubine of Emperor Taizong. After his passing, the newly anointed Emperor Li Zi, the youngest son of the late emperor, who became, well, emperor, brought Wu to the imperial court to be his own concubine. In 654, Wu bore a daughter, but shortly after the birth, it passed, with evidence showing forced death. Wu accused Empress Wang of the death, and Wang lost favor with the emperor. The most popular theory, though, is that Wu actually killed her own daughter. After that, the emperor conferred with his chancellors, and despite opposition, demoted Wang, having her imprisoned, and then Wu got promoted to empress. Later on, the emperor considered having Wang released, but Wu had her killed, because nope, she's not getting out. Upon her accession to the throne, Wu began targeting officials who would oppose her rise to power, having them arrested, imprisoned, exiled, forced to take their own lives, even worse. In 664, she accused several officers of witchcraft and had them killed, and their families became slaves within the imperial palace. In another incident, she killed her niece with poison, accused two others of death, had them killed. She eventually passed after repeated bouts with illness, but not without leaving her mark on history. Queen Mary I is a ruler who could have reserved a place in common history as the first woman to ever be the Queen of England. Instead, she's mostly remembered because of her staunch and violent opposition to the Reformation. The most controversial part of her reign was her religious policy. Despite promises a month into her rise to the throne that she would not pursue forced conversion of Protestants, she had leading Protestant churchmen imprisoned. She sought to reaffirm papal jurisdiction over England, and when the deal with Rome succeeded, acts were reinstated that allowed for the burning of people who did not follow what she wanted. This sent a wave of fear throughout England, and around 800 nobles immediately fled the country. And in February of 1555, the killings began. By the end of her terror, Mary had almost 300 people sentenced to death, most of them by burning at the stake just for the crime of being Protestant. Her reign was relatively short, lasting a little over 5 years, but it's pretty wild and it made its mark on history. And finally for today, how important was patronage for a medieval queen in terms of power and influence? Well, this act, and specifically religious patronage, was very important during that Middle Age time. It was a really active area of queenship studies because it was a way that queens could exert a lot of influence. While religious patronage could spill over into cultural patronage in terms of sponsoring the decoration of palaces and churches, it also included the founding of religious institutions that could signal political alliances at the same time. Margaret of France, Isabella of France, and Philippa of Hainaut, for example, were all patrons of Greyfriars Church in London, but that patronage was also connected to their mutual Capetian ties, because they were all related to the Capetian dynasty of France. Being on good terms with the church could be beneficial to medieval queens in other ways as well. For example, when John of England refused to pay Berengaria of Navarre the pension she was owed as the Queen Dowager and the widow of Richard I, the Pope intervened on her behalf. Isabella of Aragon, the 13th century queen consort of Denis of Portugal, is another example of a medieval queen who used this to her own advantage. Her religious activities and patronage not only gave her power and influence during her lifetime, but she was canonized as Saint Elizabeth of Portugal in 1625, and thus left a substantial legacy. And also Margaret of Scotland was similarly canonized and held up as a shining example of a medieval queen. Well, that's it for me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.